Hello, my fellow literature enthusiasts. I'm so glad you're here with me today because I have something special. And before we go any further, if you haven't yet, I'd love it if you could like this video and subscribe to the channel. Not because it's some checkbox we all have to tick in this world of algorithms, but because this space is slowly becoming a little corner of the internet where thoughtful, curious minds gather to unpack art, myth, and the beauty of storytelling. You being here, joining this conversation, matters more than you might imagine. Now, today we're diving into Tale of Tales 2015. But I want to make something clear from the start. What you're about to hear isn't a movie review in the traditional sense. This isn't me holding up a number score or rattling off a list of pros and cons like a restaurant Yelp page. Think of it instead as a deeply intellectual, theoretical, and critical exploration, rooted in the kind of conversations literature lovers have when they're halfway through a coffee that's gone cold because they're too caught up in ideas to notice. This is about looking at a work of art through the lens of myth, archetype, and emotional resonance, and letting it lead us somewhere new. I remember the first time I saw it, not on a grand cinema screen, but late at night, at home, when the house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the next room. The lighting was low, and the air had that stillness it gets just before a storm arrives. The perfect mood for a film that doesn't just tell a story, but drags you into a dreamscape of its own rules. And I'll admit something, I wasn't expecting to be moved in the way I was. I thought I'd watch something beautiful and strange, maybe even admire it from a distance like one might admire an unusual painting in a museum. But what I didn't expect was how it would crawl into my thoughts, settle there, and start whispering about the old tales we forget we know. At its surface, the film is a dark fantasy anthology, 3 stories running alongside one another, each spun from centuries-old fairy tales you probably haven't heard since childhood, if at all. But these aren't bedtime stories softened by time. They're the primal, unpolished versions. The ones that remind us fairy tales were never originally for children. They were mirrors for grown-ups, often cracked and reflecting uncomfortable truths. The film takes that essence and lets it breathe again in all its strangeness and cruelty and beauty. One story follows a queen whose desperate longing for a child drives her into a bargain with forces she doesn't understand. Another watches a king's obsessive desire lead him to strange acts that twist love into something grotesque. And then there's the tale of 2 elderly sisters, bound together by poverty and survival, who are swept into a world of desire and deception that neither can control. Each of these stories exists in its own world, yet they speak to each other in quiet ways. Echoes, rhymes, little shadows passing between them. I don't want to give everything away, because part of the magic here is watching these threads unravel and realizing midway through that you're caught in a web older than you are. Still, I'll say this much. Each story contains a moment, sometimes just a single image, that feels like
stumbling into the pages of a forgotten folktale. A queen's face lit by candlelight, her eyes fixed on something that isn't there. A cliffside with waves gnawing at its edges. A figure, cloaked and silent, waiting in the woods as though they've been waiting forever. These are moments that bypass logic and go straight to the bone, the way poetry sometimes does. The film doesn't explain itself in the way modern audiences might expect. It trusts you to wander, to sit in the ambiguity. And that's partly why it resonates so deeply with me. I've always believed that the most powerful stories don't hand you a neat, folded answer. They invite you to live inside a question. It's something I first learned from books. As a teenager, I devoured works that left me uncertain but buzzing. Calvino, Marquez, Angela Carter. They planted in me this love for narratives that are as much about mood and rhythm as they are about plot. Watching this film felt like stepping into one of those books. Only this time, the language was made of shadow and flesh instead of ink. There's a part, without spoiling it too much, where a choice is made in pure desperation, a bargain struck not because it's wise, but because the alternative is unbearable. And I think that's where the stories find their sharpest edge. We like to think we'd always choose the moral path, the reasonable action, but when desire, be it for love, beauty, power, or life itself, consumes you, reason rarely survives. It's a theme that echoes through so much of human history, through myth after myth. And here, it's rendered without judgment, but also without mercy. Something I admire is how the film's worlds feel both alien and utterly familiar. The costumes, the landscapes, the music, everything carries this weight of the ancient, but it's never just period drama dressing. There's a rawness to it, as though you're glimpsing history as it actually felt to live in, dangerous, unpredictable, at the mercy of forces you can't name. And it's not just the supernatural that creates that danger. Often, it's the human heart. I can't help but connect this to moments in my own life, not in the sense that I've fought sea monsters or bargained with dark magicians, unless you count my high school math teacher, but in the sense of being caught in choices where the stakes feel mythic, even if they're small in the world's eyes. That ache of wanting something so badly you'd risk the fallout. That hollow space left behind when you get what you wanted, and it doesn't look like you imagined. Those are the spaces where the film lives. If you've ever read the old Italian fairy tale collections, the ones with wolves that don't just eat grandmothers but trick them into dinner first, or kings who cut their own children open for omens, you'll recognize the DNA here. It's unapologetically strange, sometimes horrifying, and yet suffused with this undeniable beauty. The cinematography lingers on details the way a poet lingers on a single word. A torn seam in a gown, the shadow of a crown across a face, a droplet of blood on pale skin. One of the things I keep turning over in my mind is the way the stories play with transformation, not just the literal, physical transformations you might expect in a fairy tale, but the subtler ones, the way longing transforms a person into something unrecognizable to themselves, or the way fear can sharpen love into cruelty. It reminded me of the way, in Greek myth, transformations are often punishments or escapes, ways of breaking the unbearable tension between desire and reality. Here, too, transformation is rarely a reward. It's a consequence. And as you move through the film, you start to notice that it doesn't really separate beauty from horror. A scene might make you gasp with awe and then immediately wince, and the line between the two feels as thin as a breath. That's something I think literature people will appreciate because it mirrors the way old texts often function. No safety rails, no sanitized lessons, just the raw material of human experience, shaped into something enduring. By the time the stories wind toward their endings, if you can call them endings, you're left with a feeling that's hard to name. It's not closure, exactly. It's more like the sensation of waking from a dream and realizing it's still clinging to you, like cobwebs in your hair. And maybe that's the point. We don't carry fairy tales with us because they wrap up neatly. We carry them because they don't. Because they remind us that the human heart hasn't changed as much as we like to think. I'll confess, I've gone back to certain scenes more than once, not to untangle them, but to sit with them again. To feel that strange mix of dread and wonder. There's a moment where the camera lingers on a face, and in the silence, you can almost hear the weight of centuries pressing in. That's what I mean when I say this isn't about plot alone. It's about atmosphere, about the way a story can pull you into its current and keep you there long after the credits roll. In the end, what stays with me isn't the shock of the twists or even the grandeur of the visuals, but the way it makes me feel like I've brushed up against something ancient. Something older than the written word. And maybe that's why I wanted to share it with you, not to say, go watch this, or here's what it means, but to invite you into the same quiet, haunted space it left me in. A space where you can feel the echo of stories told around a fire, in a language you almost remember. So, here's to the stories that unsettle us, that refuse to be tamed, that leave us thinking long after they've ended. And here's to watching them together, even across distance, like we're all seated in that same dim-lit room, leaning forward as the storyteller begins. When I think back to the beginning of this story, I'm struck by how it opens like a dream already in motion. No preamble, no soft landing. You're simply there, as though you've stepped into a tapestry that someone's been weaving for centuries, and you've just happened to arrive at the moment when the colors turn dark. The first thread you encounter belongs to a queen. She is not some languid figure draped in velvet waiting to be adored. She is all edges and shadows, her gaze fixed not on her people, not on her kingdom, but on a hollow space in her life, a child she cannot have. This one is not the polite, kind one might admit over tea. It's a hunger that coils through her like smoke, seeping into every breath. And here's the thing. The film doesn't paint her longing as noble or romantic. It is
heavy, consuming, and if you've ever wanted something so badly it aches in your bones, you know it's dangerous. Her husband, the king, is not without love for her, but he is the kind of man who meets her pain with a mixture of tenderness and resignation. He speaks gently, but his words cannot fill the space she carries inside. And so, when a cloaked figure, a stranger whose very presence seems carved from the deep, offers a way to end her suffering, you can see how the moment becomes inevitable. The bargain is strange and precise. A sea creature's heart, cooked and eaten, will bring life into her womb. But nothing in this world comes without its counterweight. A warning slips into the promise like a shadow across the sun. While life will come, so too will death. What follows is one of those sequences that makes you forget to blink. The king takes to the water, hunting the creature as though the act itself is a sacred rite. The waves gnash at the sides of the boat, the air sharp with salt and inevitability. When the creature finally surfaces, it's not a monstrous leviathan, but something eerily graceful, otherworldly in the way it moves, as if it knows it's been summoned for this purpose. The kill is swift, almost reverent. The heart is brought to the queen, still steaming with the heat of its life. Now, I know enough old stories to recognize the shape of this kind of bargain. The magic is always transactional, and it rarely aligns with what we think we're buying. The queen eats, and soon enough, her body changes. But here's the twist that sits like a thorn. You're shown another woman, far away, who is also with child. A kitchen maid, tending to the cooking of that same heart. No grand feast for her, no ceremony, just a casual tasting, and yet the magic threads its way in her life, too. 2 births happen, almost like a mirrored breath. 2 boys, both pale as bone, with hair white as salt. They grow quickly, unnervingly quickly, becoming young men before your eyes. They are identical, and yet each belongs to a different world. One to the queen's palace, gilded and ordered. One to the maid's modest home, where walls are thin and life is simple. The bond between them is instant and fierce, the kind of connection that seems older than they are, as if they were never meant to be apart. And here the story does something subtle but powerful. It lets you feel that bond, lets you linger in the joy of it before you sense the queen's unease. She sees her son drawn to this other boy, this stranger, and you can almost hear the cold calculation beginning in her mind. Blood is everything to her. Control is everything. And she decides, in that quiet, dangerous way, that the connection must be severed. It's in this moment I found myself thinking about the kinds of love that cannot bear to share, the ones that mistake possession for devotion. The queen's love for her son is real, but it's a love that wants to own him entirely. And when love becomes ownership, the shadow it casts is long. The second thread of the story pulls you somewhere else entirely, into a kingdom where the king's attention is held by something peculiar. Not war, not politics, not even the queen at his side, but a creature. A flea, to be exact. At first it's almost laughable, this grizzled monarch cooing over an insect. But the flea grows, and grows, fed in secret, hidden away, until it's the size of a calf. It's absurd, yes, but also strangely sad. There's something in his doting that feels like a man trying to fill an emptiness he can't name. Of course, no secret of that scale lasts forever. When the flea dies, the king, rather than mourning in private, decides to craft a contest from it. He strips its hide and declares that any man who can identify what animal it belonged to will win his daughter's hand in marriage. A princess, young, luminous, and very much uninterested in this circus, is made into the prize of her father's grief. I remember feeling a knot form in my stomach watching her in those scenes. The way her silence spoke louder than any protest could. And sure enough, when the day comes, suitors arrive from all corners, guessing wrong one after another. Lion, ox, bear, until a figure steps forward. A man, rough, broad, with the air of someone who lives by his hands. He names it instantly, Flea, and he is right. The princess's face falls, her fate sealed not by romance or choice, but by her father's whim. The man is no prince. He is a giant, a creature of the mountains, more beast than courtier. When he takes her away, it is not in a gilded carriage, but on his back, like a hunter carrying home a prize. The journey to his home is a slow unspooling of dread. Forests giving way to jagged stone, the sky darkening, the air thinning. His dwelling is a cave, the walls slick and the air damp. The princess, who has known nothing but the softness of palace life, finds herself alone with a man who sees her not as a person, but as something he has claimed. This part unsettled me most, not because of its overt menace, but because of the way the story lets her despair stretch into the silence. Days pass. She finds scraps of food. She learns the terrain, the limits of her prison. And slowly, you see the flicker of resolve harden into something like steel. She will not die here. She will not be swallowed by this place. Then there's the third thread. Two sisters, aged and worn, living in the crumbling edges of a kingdom. Their world is small. A single room, the rhythm of chores, the hum of the market outside their door. They speak to each other in the shorthand of people who have shared a life for too long to need explanations. And yet, you can feel a yearning in one of them, a spark that flares when she hears the music of a passing parade. The king of their land is a man known for his appetites, pleasures of the table, of the body, of the moment. When his gaze happens to fall upon the sister's face, veiled by the shadows of her doorway, something in him stirs. He sends for her, but she refuses, out of shyness, perhaps, or shame, or simply the knowledge that nothing good comes from a king's sudden interest. What follows is a strange dance of pursuit and evasion, carried out through words slipped under the cover of darkness. The king becomes convinced he has found a beauty hidden from the world. The sister plays along, caught between fear and the thrill of attention. It's the kind of situation that makes you lean forward, not because you think it will end well, but because you want to understand how a single choice can unravel a life. And hunger, green-blue for strangeness and mystery. These weren't just melodies. They were emotional codes, guiding you deeper without you even realizing it. Then there's the sound design, which never tries to overwhelm you. It's full of tiny details, the hollow drip of water in an ancient hall, the faint hiss of wind curling through stone corridors, the crunch of leaves underfoot in scenes where no words are spoken. These sounds stay in your bones after the credits. Filming took the crew across Italy, and it shows. This wasn't a movie conjured in a warehouse studio. It was breathed into real spaces. Castles perched like sentinels against the sky, gorges cut deep by volcanic rivers, forests that seemed to have been waiting centuries for someone to wander into them. The production didn't just borrow these places, it made them characters. The stone walls had their own moods. The hills and valleys had tempers that shifted with the light. The editing, handled with an almost devotional patience, worked hand in hand with the cinematography. Cuts weren't made because the audience might get restless. They were made when the moment felt complete. That's why, by the end, you don't just remember what you saw, you remember the feeling of having been somewhere. But let's be honest, that kind of artistic devotion doesn't always bring in the kind of numbers a producer dreams of. The budget was large for such an unusual project. Lavish costumes, vast location shoots, meticulous sets. And when the film was released, it didn't exactly crash the box office gates. In its home country, it drew in respectable crowds, enough to show there was appreciation for what it dared to be. But internationally, it was more of a whisper than a shout. The United States barely noticed it, the kind of limited release where it plays in only a handful of theaters for a few weeks. Globally, the earnings came nowhere near matching its production costs. And yet, here's the strange thing. The people who did see it seemed to remember it vividly. This wasn't popcorn cinema you forget by the parking lot. It was a story that stayed, sometimes in fragments, sometimes in feelings. It found its way into late-night conversations, into essays, into quiet recommendations between friends who know each other's tastes. So, in a way, the filmmaking techniques shaped not just the atmosphere of the movie, but its fate in the world. By choosing a painter's pace, a poet's patience, and a composer's precision, it traded away the quick rewards of mainstream fantasy for something else entirely: timelessness. And perhaps that's the real box office, the kind that isn't counted in money, but in how long a film lives inside someone's mind. I've always thought that a cast in a film like this is more than a collection of names. They are threads in a tapestry, each dyed in its own shade, each bringing a texture the others can't. This movie, with its strange, poetic weight, needed actors who could do more than deliver lines. They had to inhabit a world that didn't exist before the cameras rolled, to breathe into it, to give it blood and heartbeat. Take Salma Hayek. She arrived on set like a queen, literally, since she played one. But it wasn't the kind of queen you think of from Disney illustrations. In interviews, she spoke about the sheer thrill of stepping into such a morally complex role, a ruler whose desperation for a child pushes her into terrifying choices. There was a glint in her eye when she admitted that it was liberating to play someone who wasn't likable in the conventional sense. She said she wanted audiences to see her hunger, not just for the child, but for power, for control, and to feel torn between judging her and understanding her. I think she succeeded. You can almost smell the salt water in that haunting feast scene, sense the tension in her jaw as she refuses to blink. Then there was Vincent Cassel, playing a king whose appetites are as boundless as they are ruinous. On set, he was apparently magnetic, not just to the cameras, but to the crew. He'd slip between takes into light-hearted banter, charming everyone, then sink into this almost predatory stillness when the cameras rolled. In one interview, he confessed that his character's vanity and lust made him uncomfortable at times. Yet, he added with a half-smile, that discomfort is where the truth is. He talked about the way the director encouraged him to push the performance to the edge of absurdity without tipping into parody, to keep the king grounded in the world's rules, no matter how ridiculous those rules might be. Toby Jones, quiet and precise, approached his role like an old craftsman carving wood. His character, a king with an obsession for a giant flea, was one of the most surreal in the entire film, and Jones leaned into that absurdity with total sincerity. In a post-screening Q&A, he said the trick was to never wink at the audience. You can't let them know you think it's funny, he explained, because to him, it's not funny. It's everything. That's what made his performance work. He treated the bizarre with the same gravity you'd give to Shakespearean tragedy. John C. Reilly, though his screen time was brief, brought a kind of wounded humanity that made his character linger long after he was gone. People who saw the film often mentioned his presence, soft-spoken but solid, a figure of loyalty and quiet sacrifice. In an interview, he described the role as small but sharp, like a pebble in the shoe that keeps you aware of your step. The younger actors, B.B. Cave, Stacey Martin, Christian Lees, brought their own fire to the set. B.B. Cave, in particular, surprised many, playing a character whose innocence is tested by cruelty and deception. She carried scenes with a kind of openness that made the pain hit harder. In a candid moment during a festival interview, she admitted that some of the emotional sequences left her so raw she'd have to take long walks after filming, just to feel human again. What fascinated me most in their collective interviews was how unified they were in describing the director's approach. They all spoke of his painter's eye, his insistence on letting moments breathe. Vincent Cassel said it was the slowest film he'd ever shot, not because the crew was disorganized, but because every frame was being built like a painting, shadows adjusted, fabrics tested against light, actors placed like figures in a composition. Salma Hayek described waiting long minutes before action was called, simply because the director was watching the way the breeze moved through her veil, deciding if it was right. Small, but there's a thread there, invisible at first, that begins to hum louder the deeper you go, the way desire bends people. How love, whether for a child, a lover, or a dream, can grow so large it becomes unrecognizable, even dangerous. Take The Queen's Tale. On its surface, it's about longing for motherhood. But what I kept feeling, sitting there, was how often our most sacred wishes come with a hidden bill we don't read before signing. The Queen's love for her unborn child is absolute before he even exists. So absolute, she's willing to sacrifice, deceive, even kill for it. The whiteness of the albino son she bears becomes this strange emblem, pure, otherworldly, and yet marked. His hair isn't just hair. It's a flag waving over the entire plot, announcing that this child is the product of magic, of tampering with a natural order. You can't unsee it, just like she can't see him as simply a boy. That, to me, is where the tragedy begins, not in the magic, but in the way her love already has conditions she won't admit. The king and the flea. Well, that's the kind of symbolism you could chew on for days. Raising a flea to monstrous size feels absurd, grotesque, even comedic. But look closer, and it's about misplaced devotion, about pouring your energy into something that cannot love you back. I think about how the king dotes on that creature, how he feeds it, shelters it, even hides it away, and I see a mirror for every relationship or ambition that's eaten up more of our lives than it should. The flea becomes a kind of shrine to loneliness, and when it dies, the king's grief is so sharp he creates a deadly riddle out of its hide, dooming his own daughter in the process. That's the real sting, the way grief can make us cruel without meaning to. Then there's the king chasing a voice. That one feels like it was stolen from a fever dream. He hears beauty, assumes it belongs to youth, to perfection, and becomes intoxicated with an image he's made up in his own head. When he discovers the truth, that the woman he's pursued is aged, frail, he recoils. But then the magic intervenes, and the woman is transformed into the beauty he imagined, at least for a time. Here's the thing. Her beauty comes at the cost of her sister, her past, herself. This, to me, is where the film turns the knife, because it shows how easily we trade away what's real for what's desirable, how transformation is rarely a gift without a curse sewn into its hem. The symbolism isn't just in the objects or the plot turns. It's in textures, colors, even the pacing of the scenes. The deep, blood-red corridors in the Queen's castle aren't just pretty. They're womb-like, protective, and suffocating at the same time. The sun-drenched hills where the king pursues the singing woman are open, endless, and yet feel like a trap because they're saturated with his gaze. Even the flea's dark, damp chamber carries meaning. It's a space of secrecy and decay, where something unnatural has been allowed to grow unchecked. And then there's the water. Oh, the water. It's everywhere in these stories, sliding between scenes like a silent conspirator. The Queen plunges into it to claim her child. Lovers meet near it. Voices carry over it. Monsters rise from it. Water here is both life and danger, fertility and drowning wrapped in one shifting symbol. It's the most honest element in the film. It gives and takes without apology. The themes braid together in ways that make you question your own definitions of love, beauty, and devotion. Every character is chasing something, a child, a lover, an ideal, and every chase comes with a price. And the prices are always paid in the coin of identity. They lose themselves, or they become someone they weren't meant to be. Or, worse, they become exactly what they were meant to be, and it destroys them. What lingers for me is how little moral judgment the film seems to pass. It doesn't wag a finger at the Queen, or the King, or the sisters. It just lays them bare and says, this is what wanting does. This is what happens when you take a story and pull it tight until the threads show. It feels more like an ancient warning than a modern screenplay, the kind of tale that would be whispered by firelight with no one quite sure where it came from. Even a magic isn't pure fantasy. It's just an amplifier. It takes the characters' flaws and magnifies them until they can't be ignored. And maybe that's why the imagery stays with you. You remember the Queen's pale son, not just because he's striking, but because he stands for every child born under the weight of someone else's unyielding expectations. You remember the flea because it's ridiculous and horrifying and utterly human in its symbolism. You remember the sisters because they embody the way beauty and cruelty dance in step. By the end, you realize that the film's world isn't so far from ours. We may not strike bargains with sea monsters or raise monstrous insects, but we do chase ideals. We do cling to the wrong things. We do make sacrifices that turn to ash in our hands. The stories are fairy tales, yes, but they're also mirrors, just warped enough to make us lean in closer. And maybe that's the point, to lean in, to see the reflection and the distortion at the same time. To leave the theater with a head full of strange images and a heart full of questions, knowing you've been told something true, even if you can't quite name it. I still remember the first time I saw this film, not just because of what was on the screen, but because of the way it moved. It didn't rush at me. It let me step into its rooms, walk its echoing hallways, and take in the texture of its air. That's when I realized this wasn't directed like a movie, it was painted. Every shot looked like something you could frame. Every shadow, every slant of sunlight was placed like a deliberate brushstroke. You could almost smell the oil paint. That comes from the director's roots, not in theater, not in commercial cinema, but in fine art. You can see it in the way scenes are lit as though the characters are sitting for a portrait. The light doesn't just illuminate faces. It teases them, keeps parts of them in darkness, as if we're only ever allowed to know a fraction of their secrets. The darkness isn't empty. It's alive with suggestion. The camera didn't behave like an impatient narrator either. It stayed. It lingered. In most films, a scene might be chopped up into quick edits. Every glance, every gesture broken into pieces and reassembled. But here the shots breathe. They let you feel the passage of time. The silences are not filler. They are part of the music. And speaking of music, Alexander Desplat's score was like silk unraveling in 3 colors. Black for grief and royal tragedy, red for obsession. These 3 stories run side by side, each with its own rhythm, its own landscape, and yet they begin to echo each other. A bargain made in desperation. A contest with a cruel prize. A yearning that draws danger closer. I found myself thinking about the way myths and folktales often braid themselves together like this. 3 rivers that begin apart but feed the same sea. Back in the Queen's world, her son and the other boy continue to meet in secret. There's a joy in their togetherness, but also a recklessness. The Queen's disapproval grows colder, harder, until it becomes action. She sends men to drive the other boy away, permanently. But the boy survives, slipping through the cracks of her plan, returning to his twin-like brother with the quiet defiance of someone who refuses to be erased. In the giant's cave, the princess begins her escape in small steps, literally. She learns the rhythm of his comings and goings, the places he does not watch closely. One day, while he's away, she slips down the mountain, her hands raw from clinging to the stone, her dress torn. The forest swallows her. She is no longer the girl in silk. She is something leaner, harder, and more desperate. For the sister courted by the king, the charade becomes impossible to sustain. There comes a night when she can no longer hide behind shadows, and the truth of her face, her age, her life is revealed. The king's reaction is swift and brutal, disgust replacing desire. She's cast out, left broken. But here, too, the story refuses to follow a neat moral path. A strange turn brings her not ruin, but transformation, and in that transformation lies both beauty and tragedy. What struck me most, watching these events unfold, is how each character's fate is propelled not by some abstract destiny, but by their own hungers they cannot name until they've already stepped too far. And in that way, it feels achingly human. I think about the Queen, standing in her high chambers, watching her son with the boy who mirrors him. About the princess, scrambling over rocks, the sound of the giant's roar echoing somewhere far, but too close. About the sister, staring at her own hands as if seeing them for the first time, wondering what it means to be remade. There's a point, not far from here, where all these strands will begin to tighten. You can feel it. The air in the story shifts, the music changes. The first ripples of something larger move through the edges. But for now, the river keeps winding, pulling you deeper, each bend revealing something you didn't expect, something you can't quite look away from. The air in the tale grows heavier here, as though the stories themselves have realized time is running short and must now reveal what they've been hiding. The sunlight, where it exists, feels brittle. Shadows stretch further, like they're trying to cover everything before the final act. And yet, there's no rush. This is not a world that hurries. It simply unfolds, certain that whatever is coming cannot be escaped. The queen still watches her son with that quiet ferocity, half love, half possession. The other boy, the one born to the kitchen maid, has become something of a ghost in her palace, always appearing where he shouldn't, always welcomed by the prince, always vanishing before she can have him removed. She tries again to sever the tie, this time more decisively. A hunt is arranged, a test of skill for the prince, but in truth, it's bait for the boy. The plan works in a way. The boy is lured into danger, not from the animals they claim to be hunting, but from men who know what they're really there to do. And yet, as if the forest itself refuses to give him up, he escapes again. There's something almost mythic in the way the two young men keep finding each other, their bond stronger than the queen's will. But myth has a habit of turning its own beauty into tragedy, and you can feel that edge coming closer. Far away, in the mountains, the princess's escape is not the end of her ordeal, but the beginning of a harder road. The forest she fled into is not the lush, welcoming kind. It's a labyrinth of thorns and shadows, every path leading her deeper into uncertainty. Hunger gnaws at her. Her fine clothes are shredded to nothing. She drinks from muddy pools and sleeps in the crooks of trees, and each day the giant's shadow seems to move through the woods behind her, patient, relentless. It is in this state, half wild herself, that she comes upon a group of traveling entertainers. Their leader is a woman with a voice like gravel and eyes that weigh everything they see. She offers shelter, food, protection, but not for nothing. The princess must earn her place among them, performing for the coins of strangers. And here the story pauses, letting you watch her transform. Not the sudden, magical transformation of fairy tales, but the slow, bitter kind born of survival. Her movements become sharper, her words fewer. She learns how to charm a crowd with a single look, how to hide a blade in her sleeve, how to make herself untouchable even when surrounded. In the crumbling house of the two sisters, the aftermath of the king's rejection has taken a strange turn. The sister who deceived him, shamed and discarded, finds herself in the care of an old woman in the hills, a figure who seems to know more about the boundaries between worlds than she should. With herbs, whispers, and a night spent in a bath of milk so white it gleams in the moonlight, the old woman changes her. Her skin smooths. Her hair shines. The years fall away as though they were only dust on her shoulders. When she returns to the court, the king sees her anew, without recognizing who she is. His desire rekindles instantly, and this time he does not hesitate. She is dressed in silks, housed in luxury, made the center of his world. But there is a cruel irony here. Her sister is left behind, still aged, still poor, still staring at the door through which her other half vanished into a life they had once shared. The neglected sister's yearning curdles into something darker. She finds her way to the same old woman in the hills, demanding the same gift. But the magic, if it can be called that, is not a thing to be ordered like wine at a table. What follows is not beauty, but distortion, a transformation that strips away the human and leaves behind something other. When she returns to court, it is not to reclaim a place at her sister's side, but to bring the whole fragile illusion crashing down. In the palace of the queen, the tension between her son and the other boy reaches its breaking point. The prince, realizing that every moment with his friend is shadowed by his mother's disapproval, makes a choice. They will leave together, slipping away before dawn. The plan is simple, but in fairy tales, simplicity is often an invitation for fate to intervene. And it does. On the road, they are met not by soldiers or assassins, but by something stranger, a beast from the queen's own menagerie, let loose with a hunger it cannot deny. The fight is brutal and quick. When it's over, one of the boys lies still, and the other kneels beside him, hands red, face pale. I've often thought about that moment, the stillness that follows violence. It's as if the world takes a deep breath, deciding what it will allow to happen next. The surviving boy carries his friend back to the palace, not in triumph, but in the slow, steady way someone carries the weight they know they'll never set down again. The queen greets him, and for the first time, her face shows something like fear. Far from there, the princess's time with the entertainers reaches its own turning point. A wealthy nobleman, amused by the performance, offers to buy her freedom from the troupe. She accepts, not out of gratitude, but because she sees in him a means to an end. His estate lies near the border of her old kingdom. At night, while he sleeps, she slips away, dressed in plain clothes, her face hidden beneath a hood. She will return home, but not as the girl who left. The king, for his part, has grown restless with his new beauty. He is a man who tires quickly of what he possesses, and though the transformed sister still captivates him, his gaze begins to wander. She sees it happening, feels the old fear creeping back, the fear of being discarded. And when her sister appears at court, changed in ways that defy the eye's comfort, the delicate structure of her life collapses. The final unraveling of these stories happens not in grand battles or public declarations, but in private rooms, on hidden roads, in quiet exchanges that carry the weight of everything that's come before. The queen's son, grieving but alive, inherits the emptiness she's always carried, though his is shaped differently. The princess stands in the courtyard of her family's palace, welcomed home by faces she doesn't recognize as much as she remembers, her smile a mask that hides all she has endured. The sisters, bound together again by ruin rather than love, leave the court behind entirely, walking into a future that feels less like redemption and more like inevitability. And here's the strange thing. The story doesn't tell you who wins. It doesn't tie each ribbon neatly, doesn't hand you a moral to put in your pocket. Instead, it leaves you with images, the gleam of white hair in torchlight, a crown discarded on a stone floor, a hand reaching out, not to hold, but to push away. It's a reminder that in these kinds of tales, resolution isn't about justice or punishment. It's about the recognition that every choice, every hunger has its cost. And in that way, it feels truer to life than any happily ever after could. Because the truth is, sometimes the ending isn't about what is gained, but about what is survived. When the final frame fades, it's as if the air itself exhales. You're left blinking, not entirely sure if you've been watching a story, dreaming it, or remembering something told to you long ago in a voice you trusted. And maybe that's the point. These are not stories meant to be finished. They're meant to stay with you, to rise up in fragments when you least expect them, to whisper their warnings and wonders in the quiet places of your mind. The characters in this tangled tapestry are not merely people. They're archetypes clothed in flesh, the echoes of centuries-old roles that humanity keeps reshaping and repeating. They move through the story like figures in an illuminated manuscript, luminous and strange, their actions both inevitable and entirely their own. And yet, what fascinates me most is how each one resists being reduced to a single moral or symbolic function. They are contradictory, layered, shifting in light and shadow like faces glimpsed through rippling water. The queen is perhaps the clearest anchor among them, not because she is easy to read, but because her desire is so absolute it refuses to be hidden. She begins as a woman defined by an absence, the child she cannot have. That emptiness is not passive. It devours her from within, reshaping her every thought and choice. In myths, a figure like hers would be the desperate mother willing to barter her soul for life, and she follows that tradition faithfully. But the story refuses to sanctify her sacrifice. Her quest for motherhood is not framed as noble altruism. It is obsession. And obsession, in these tales, is both power and poison. What makes her compelling is the tension between her vulnerability and her control. She is fragile in her yearning, but ruthless in protecting the result of her bargain. Her love for her son is genuine, yet it curdles into something possessive, even predatory, when threatened. I can't help but see in her the same tragic arc of characters like Medea or Clytemnestra, figures whose ferocity is born from love, but whose hands are stained by it. She is not good, nor is she villainous in a simple way. She is an embodiment of the truth that love can wound as deeply as it heals. Her son, by contrast, moves through the story with the openness of someone who has never been told the world will deny him what he wants. He is warm where she is cold, trusting where she is calculating. Yet his life is shaped entirely by her choices. He is the gift she demanded from the world, and he lives under the shadow of the cost it exacted. His bond with the boy who mirrors him feels almost fated, like two halves of a whole split at birth. There is joy in their connection, but also defiance. Being together is an act of resistance against the queen's control. The other boy, born to the kitchen maid, is perhaps the most elusive. He carries the same physical traits as the prince, but without the trappings of wealth and safety. His life is one of quiet resilience. He survives where others might submit. He is not defined by power, yet he has a strength the prince lacks, the ability to exist without approval. This independence is precisely what draws the queen's ire and the prince's admiration. Together, the two young men seem to form a single character split across two lives, one marked by privilege and the other by survival, each reflecting the other's possibilities. The king with the flea is a figure both absurd and tragic. His tenderness toward the creature is real, but it is also grotesque, affection misplaced, invested in something that cannot return it. In this, he becomes almost a parody of monarchs in old tales, those who ignore the needs of their kingdom in favor of private indulgences. Yet there's an undercurrent of melancholy in his actions. The flea is a surrogate for something he's lost or never had, and when it dies, his grief twists into the cruel spectacle of the contest for his daughter's hand. His inability to connect his sorrow to the reality of his child's life marks him as a man adrift from empathy, unable or unwilling to see beyond his own needs. His daughter, the princess, is one of the most quietly transformative characters. At first, she seems to be the archetypal pawn in a king's game, a prize to be won, voiceless in her own fate. But her arc is not about remaining a victim. Once taken by the giant, she adapts with startling speed, stripping away the layers of refinement that had once defined her. What's remarkable about her transformation is that it's not romanticized. She doesn't become a heroine through grand gestures or idealized courage. She becomes one through grit, calculation, and an unflinching willingness to do what survival requires. By the time she returns home, she is not the same person, nor does she pretend to be. Her power lies in the fact that she no longer depends on anyone else's vision of her worth. The giant is almost a creature from folklore, a force of nature rather than a fully human presence. Yet he isn't mindless. His capture of the princess is deliberate, the act of a man accustomed to taking what he wants without question. He is a figure of unchecked physical dominance, but also of isolation. His home in the mountains is barren, his life solitary. In this, he becomes a distorted mirror of the princess's father. Both are men who see her as property, though for different reasons. The giant's downfall is not his cruelty, but his inability to recognize that possession does not ensure loyalty. The two sisters in the third thread are perhaps the most overtly symbolic figures, yet they're also some of the most human. They begin in near total unity, their lives intertwined by necessity and shared hardship. But the arrival of the king's attention fractures that unity. The sister who first engages with him is driven by a longing that is not just romantic, but existential. She wants to be seen, to be desired, to be something more than a shadow on the edge of the market. Her deception is a desperate gamble for transformation, and in a way, it works. The magic she gains remakes her into the beauty she believed she needed to be. Yet the tragedy is that her worth, in her own eyes and the king's, remains dependent on that illusion. The other sister, left behind, embodies the bitterness of exclusion. Her jealousy is not born from petty spite, but from the rupture of a life that had always been shared. When she seeks the same magic, her failure is inevitable. Not because she is less deserving, but because the story understands that desire, once poisoned by envy, curdles into something that destroys rather than transforms. Her altered form becomes a living testament to the danger of wanting what someone else has without understanding what it cost them to get it. The king in their thread is pure appetite. He is not malicious so much as he is indifferent, a man who consumes beauty and pleasure without considering the lives attached to them. In him, you can see the echoes of countless fairy tale rulers whose whims reshape the fates of those around them. What makes him unnerving is not that he wields his power cruelly, but that he does so casually, without the self-awareness to recognize it as cruelty. What binds these characters together, across their separate tales, is a shared vulnerability to desire, whether it's for a child, for beauty, for freedom, or for possession. Each is driven by a want that consumes reason, reshapes identity, and ultimately forces them into a confrontation with the cost of their longing. None of them emerge unchanged, but few emerge in ways they would have chosen. The queen ends with her son still alive, but altered, his grief a mirror of her own early emptiness. The prince and the other boy are parted not by choice, but by the brutal logic of survival. The princess returns to her kingdom, but her smile is a shield rather than a reflection of joy. The sisters are reunited, but their bond has been twisted into something that no longer resembles the closeness they once had. The kings remain, one bereft of his illusion, the other unchanged in his appetites, but the worlds around them bear the scars of what they've done. In the end, I think of these characters less as individuals and more as embodiments of ancient patterns, roles that humanity keeps playing out in new costumes and new settings. The mother who loves too fiercely and thus destroys. The ruler who mistakes possession for care. The lover who chases an ideal until it consumes them. The sibling whose love turns to rivalry. The captive who learns that survival requires transformation. And yet, they're not just symbols. The story allows them moments of intimacy, hesitation, tenderness, small fractures in the mythic surface where you glimpse the human beneath. That's what makes them linger after the tale is done. They are both timeless and specific, as much creatures of this one strange narrative as they are reflections of the stories we've been telling for as long as we've had the words. They leave you with the uncomfortable truth that in these worlds, as in ours, the end of a story does not guarantee the end of a longing. It began, as these things often do, with an obsession. Matteo Garrone, known for his stark and unflinching portrayals of reality, found himself unexpectedly seduced by the fantastical. It wasn't the glossy, neatly packaged fairy tales of modern cinema that called to him, but something older, darker, and more primal. The 17th century Neapolitan folk stories collected by Giambattista Basile. In their unvarnished form, these tales were strange and brutal, full of grotesque creatures, lust, violence, and the absurd logic of dreams. Where others might have seen them as too archaic or unsettling for a modern audience, Garrone saw a rare chance to return to the roots of storytelling, a place where fantasy didn't hide its teeth. He chose 3 stories from Basile's sprawling Pentamerone, each one centered on a woman at a different stage of life: youth, motherhood, and old age. They would unfold side by side, connected not by plot, but by an invisible thread, desire taken to dangerous extremes. This would be his first English-language film, his largest budget yet, and perhaps his most visually ambitious project. From the start, Garrone rejected the idea of building his fantasy world inside studio walls. He wanted the settings to be both impossibly magical and undeniably real. And so began a journey through the length of Italy, searching for places that felt as if they had stepped out of a dream. Castles balanced on cliffs, palaces with corridors like labyrinths, gorges carved from ancient lava, and forests so dense they seemed to hold secrets in their shadows. When the scouting ended, his map of locations looked like a patchwork quilt of Italian history and geography. The whitestone fortress of Castel del Monte, the grand and slightly eerie Donna Fugita Castle in Sicily, complete with its own hedge maze. The volcanic Alcanara Gorges, whose twisted rock formations would cradle a sea monster. The castle of Rocca Scalegna in Abruzzo, perched high above the earth like something a mad king might build in a fever dream. And the Moorish wonder of Samazzano Castle in Tuscany, its walls painted in kaleidoscopic patterns. Filming began in the spring of 2014 and lasted for 4 months. Garrone's approach was almost painterly. Each location was lit and framed to look like an old master's canvas, rich in texture, shadows, and saturated colors that seemed to hum with age. The costumes, designed by Massimo Cantini-Parini, were works of art in themselves. Layered fabrics, heavy embroidery, and silhouettes that could have stepped out of a Renaissance portrait. The actors quickly learned that wearing these costumes was as much a physical challenge as an aesthetic one. Salma Hayek, playing a queen consumed by her longing for a child, once found herself literally trapped by the weight of her gown. During a scene in the castle maze, she stumbled and couldn't get back up without help. The crew rushed in to lift her, trying to protect both the actress and the delicate layers of the dress. In her memory, the moment was half comedy, half struggle, myth colliding with practical reality. Garrone's love for the tangible extended to the film's creatures. Though visual effects were used sparingly, the team relied heavily on prosthetics, puppetry, and makeup. The giant flea, the sea dragon, the transformed bodies of enchanted sisters, all were built with physical materials that gave them weight and texture on screen. Garrone believed that fantasy needed something you could almost touch. If a monster feels too perfect, too digital, it loses its strangeness. One of the most unforgettable sequences, the queen devouring the heart of a sea monster, was filmed with a physical prop. The heart was a convincingly grotesque creation from the effects department. During a break in filming, Garrone's young son and his classmates visited the set. Someone decided to show them the prop, and in an almost comic twist, it fell apart in front of the children, splattering bits of its fake innards and forcing the team to quickly repair it before shooting could resume. The scene was carefully choreographed for Hayek's performance. A small bucket, hidden just off camera, was placed at her side so she could spit out each bite immediately after filming. No one watching the film would ever guess it was there, but on set, it was as necessary as the prop itself. In quieter moments, Garrone filled the screen with subtle nods to art history. In one scene, when a young Princess Violet plays guitar, her pose and the fall of light are deliberate echoes of a Vermeer painting. Such details were never pointed out to the audience. They were there like whispers for those who might notice. The cast adapted to Garrone's directing style, which was unlike anything many of them had experienced. He encouraged improvisation, but also demanded a deep surrender to the physical world of the film. For B.B. Cave, who played Violet, this meant learning to carry the character's defiance and innocence not just in her voice, but in the way she moved through spaces designed to overwhelm her. The music, composed by Alexander Desplat, was as carefully considered as the visuals. Garrone asked for 3 distinct tonal palettes, one for each story. Black tones for the Queen's Tale, red for the thread of sexual desire, and cool blues and greens for the odd melancholy of the flea story. The result was a score that shifted between the tales like changing weather, sometimes lush and romantic, sometimes sharp and unsettling. Even Garrone's camera work carried personal echoes. In the way he shot the submerged sea monster through the distorted glass of a diving mask, there was a direct connection to a scene from his earlier film, The Embalmer. He liked to tuck these self-referential moments into his work, little secret bridges between his films. When Tale of Tales premiered again in 2015, the response was immediate and divided in the way only ambitious films provoke. Some critics were intoxicated by its visual richness, comparing it to faded boudoirs, antique oil paintings, and the dangerous beauty of old fairy tales. Others found its 3 strands too disconnected, the stories too stubbornly self-contained. But even those who questioned its structure admitted that its images stayed with them, more like dreams than scenes. And dreams have a way of lingering. Years later, people who couldn't recall the film's title still remember the oddities. The giant flea, the sisters tricking a king, the woman eating a monster's heart. These fragments floated in their minds, unmoored from the whole, but still potent. Behind all of this, the costumes, the locations, the creatures, was Garrone's determination to make fantasy feel ancient and real at the same time. He approached the production not as a glossy spectacle, but as a living thing. Mistakes and accidents were not simply tolerated. They were often woven into the fabric of the final film. A torn costume, an unexpected change in light, a prop that refused to behave. These became part of the movie's strange heartbeat. In the end, the strangest facts about Tale of Tales are not just about its production, but about its nature. It is a fantasy built on truth, real locations, real costumes, real objects, and real human effort, layered together to create something that feels like a dream remembered from another lifetime. It's one thing to watch a film like this, letting it wash over you in a blur of images, colors, and sounds, and quite another to sit with it afterward, to keep turning over the stones it has placed in your mind, examining what lies beneath. When I think back on it, certain moments rise above the rest, not because they're louder or more extravagant, but because they carry a peculiar kind of gravity. They feel as though they were stitched not just into the film, but into me. One of those moments comes early on, when the queen, desperate for a child, is told by a mysterious necromancer that her wish can be granted if she will eat the heart of a sea creature cooked by a virgin. It's a grotesque request, framed with almost casual cruelty. From a purely narrative standpoint, it's the ignition point, a decision that sets her story in motion. But from a critical perspective, it is something far richer, a crystallization of desire's dangerous hunger. This is not the yearning of a woman in a sentimental fairy tale. It is obsession rendered with the same physicality as the heart she will devour. The scene itself is deliberate in its pacing. There is no rush to the heart's arrival, no hurried cut to the queen's act of consumption. Instead, Garrone lingers. We see the sea monster's body in the water, the eerie, muffled distortion as divers approach it. We feel the heaviness of the object as it's carried, as if the camera itself is burdened by its presence. By the time the queen bites into it, the act feels less like a magical rite and more like an unholy communion. From a thematic standpoint, this moment establishes the film's refusal to sanitize the old fairy tale traditions. It embraces the primal, the bodily, the uncomfortable. And yet, there's another layer to it. This act of consuming something sacred or cursed for the sake of creation reflects a pattern that recurs in the other stories: the cost of desire. Whether it's the king nurturing a giant flea or an old woman longing to recapture youth, each character is pulled towards something they believe will complete them, only to discover that fulfillment demands something monstrous in return. The heart-eating scene becomes a metaphor for the film's entire structure. Every wish is a feast, and every feast has a hidden poison. Then there's the flea. On paper, it's absurd. A king becomes obsessed with a flea he finds in his castle, feeding it until it grows to monstrous proportions. But Garrone frames the absurdity with such solemn care that it starts to feel like an allegory. From a critical perspective, the flea is more than a curiosity. It's a slow-building metaphor for misplaced devotion and the dangerous way affection can be redirected toward the unworthy. Watching the king care for this insect, stroking it, feeding its scraps from his table, you can't help but feel a faint unease. It's a relationship built on isolation. The flea becomes a stand-in for real human connection. When it dies, the king's grief is palpable, but his next decision is devastating. He skins the flea, uses its hide in a trial for his daughter's hand in marriage, and in doing so, hands her over to an ogre. The critical weight of this moment lies in its grotesque circularity. Love twisted into neglect, and neglect into a terrible fate for someone else. The absurd humor of the premise melts away, leaving only the cold logic of consequences. Then we have the sisters, the old women whose story begins in shadows and whispers. When the king hears one of them singing, he becomes captivated by the voice alone, believing it belongs to a young beauty. The sister, Dora, arranges to meet him in darkness so that her true appearance is concealed. This, too, is an old folk motif, the lover deceived by beauty they cannot see. But here it becomes something stranger. When the king finally sees her in the light, he reacts with violence, throwing her from a window. It is easy to dismiss this moment as one of the film's many instances of cruelty, but from a critical perspective, it reveals the brutal underbelly of desire built on illusion. The king's attraction evaporates when faced with reality. His violence is as sudden and irrational as his infatuation. Yet the story doesn't end in tragedy for Dora. Saved by a witch, she is given youth and beauty, only to turn on her sister, now disgusted by the old age they once shared. This transformation is perhaps one of the film's most biting commentaries. Beauty doesn't heal betrayal, it deepens it. One of the striking things about all these events is how they resist the kind of moral closure we often expect from fairy tales. There is no neat punishment for wrongdoers, no reward for virtue. Instead, each resolution feels organic to the character's own flaws and desires. The queen gets her child, but loses him to the natural pull of independence. The king with the flea dies at the hands of the ogre, his folly catching up to him in a brutal, almost inevitable way. Dora enjoys her beauty, but severs the one bond that defined her life. From a thematic standpoint, this refusal to impose moral order is one of the film's most important choices. It aligns with the source material's 17th century sensibility, where stories were not always meant to guide behavior, but to reflect the strangeness and danger of life itself. In that sense, the film becomes almost anthropological, preserving a worldview in which magic does not serve justice. It serves whim and fate. The emotional resonance of these events is heightened by Garrone's visual strategy. He shoots moments of horror and beauty with the same reverence. The camera lingers on a sunlit castle courtyard with the same patience it gives to a blood-streaked dungeon wall. This equality of gaze forces the viewer into a state of constant alertness. You can't predict whether the next frame will hold a tender smile or a dismembered body. The effect is unsettling in the best way. It mirrors the unpredictability of the stories themselves. From a critical reception standpoint, this deliberate tonal ambiguity was divisive. Some praised it as a bold return to the true, unsanitized fairy tale tradition. Others found it alienating, even indulgent. But what's undeniable is that the film's events linger in memory longer than its structure. People remember the queen's stained lips after eating the heart. They remember the monstrous flea's hide laid out like a grotesque tapestry. They remember the sight of an old woman transformed, not into a moral lesson, but into a creature of vanity. For me, the emotional power of the film lies in its ability to hold beauty and horror in the same breath. It doesn't give us the comfort of knowing who deserves what. Instead, it asks us to sit with the idea that desire, whether for love, youth, power, or a child, can lead us down paths we would never have walked otherwise, and that the end of the path may be nothing like the vision that pulled us forward. It's not a film that reassures. It's a film that lingers like a half-remembered dream, one in which the images are vivid, the feelings are strong, and the meaning shifts every time you think you found it. And that, I think, is where its true impact lies, in the way it refuses to settle into a single interpretation, leaving us to wander its strange corridors long after the credits fade. It began not with a script, but with a painter's obsession. Matteo Garrone had just come from the world of gritty, grounded dramas when he stumbled across a centuries-old book of Italian fairy tales by Giambattista Basile. They weren't neat, moral little fables. They were wild, unsettling, and achingly beautiful in their strangeness. He saw in them a cinematic opportunity to bring myth to life in a way that felt both ancient and startlingly real. From the very beginning, Garrone refused the sterile comfort of green screens and fabricated sets. Instead, he sent his location scouts across Italy, chasing whispers of castles that seemed to have been dreamt rather than built. One of the first discoveries was a fortress perched on a jagged rock in Abruzzo, balanced so precariously it seemed ready to topple into the clouds. Then there was the regal melancholy of a Sicilian castle, its corridors dark as if they'd been waiting for centuries for someone to walk them again. In Apulia, they found Castel del Monte, mathematically perfect, almost alien in its symmetry. And in Tuscany, the Moorish fantasy of Samazzano Castle, its rooms painted in dizzying geometries that made reality feel like a hallucination. He wasn't simply choosing backdrops. He was choosing characters. Each location had a personality, a silent will, and Garrone wanted them to speak in the film as clearly as any actor. The goal was artificial truth, settings so precise in their beauty they seemed like studio creations, yet were stubbornly real. When filming began in the spring of 2014, the production felt like a traveling circus of painters, tailors, puppeteers, and actors moving from one piece of history to another. The cinematographer, Peter Sashitsky, approached each shot like a canvas, bathing stone walls in muted gold, letting the green of moss and the silver of fog whisper their own lines. The cast was a tapestry of personalities: Salma Hayek, Vincent Cassel, Toby Jones, John C. Reilly, Shirley Henderson, B.B. Cave. Garrone's direction wasn't about dictating, but conversing. He encouraged improvisation, letting the actors bend their roles into something intimate and unexpected. Salma, playing a queen with a desperate hunger, once described the experience as bizarre, confusing, beautiful, invigorating. Every day was an adventure. Of course, fairy tales on film are never without their own small disasters. The queen's gown, a towering creation of velvet and embroidery, was so heavy Salma could barely walk in it. One day, Garrone spotted a shaft of perfect light falling across a castle corridor and insisted she run for a close-up. She tried, and promptly got stuck halfway through the motion. Crew members swarmed in, lifting the skirt like a stubborn sail caught in the wind. They saved the shot, but the laughter behind the camera nearly ruined the take. Garrone insisted on building as much as possible by hand. The monstrous flea, the sinewy dragon, the grotesque transformations. These were sculpted, stitched, and painted by artisans rather than conjured entirely by computers. Digital effects were used sparingly, as a polish over something tangible. The actors often found themselves face-to-face with creatures that could actually blink, snarl, or crumble, and that weight, the physical presence, made the performances sharper, stranger, more human. One day, a school group visited the set just as the crew was preparing the infamous heart-eating scene. The prop heart was a thing of disturbing beauty, red, glistening, pulsing faintly under the lights. As the children stared in a mix of fascination and horror, the thing split open, spilling its fake insides onto the floor. The room fell silent. Then the props team, laughing, scrambled to repair it. Salma had her own private struggle during that scene. A discreet bucket placed off-camera so she could spit out the sticky mixture after each take. The score was its own hidden craft. Alexander Desplat composed 3 distinct musical worlds, each tied to one of the intertwining stories. Regal and mournful for the Queen's tale, rich and sultry for the thread of lust and seduction, airy and bittersweet for the odd, tender tragedy of the flea. The music wove between them like invisible stitching, pulling the film's disparate pieces into a single tapestry. Even before a single scene was shot, the script had been whittled down from 6 or 7 possible tales to just 3. Garrone saw them as a life cycle: youth, motherhood, and old age. He resisted pressure to add more, believing each one needed space to breathe. The production was the most ambitious of his career, with a budget of around 12 million euros cobbled together from Italian, French, and British backers. Every euro had to be stretched without dulling the film's lush texture. Garrone admitted more than once that the technical hurdles, costumes, prosthetics, practical effects, could have overwhelmed the project. But he treated those hurdles like the strange creatures in the stories, obstacles to be confronted, tamed, and in a way, befriended. When the film finally premiered at Cannes in 2015, the audience reactions were as unpredictable as the film itself. Some laughed in surprise, others sat in reverent silence. People leaned forward to ask about the castles, the dresses, the flea. And behind all of it was that lingering, essential thing Garrone had chased from the start. The feeling that you were looking at something ancient yet alive, as if the stones themselves had just now decided to tell you their story. The making of the film became, in its own quiet way, part of the myth. There was no clean line between the fantasy on screen and the labor, accidents, and moments of joy behind it. Someone jokes that she could use it as armor if the sea monster decides to wander onto set. Salma laughs, but later she tells me that moving in it was like carrying another body on her back. Garrone loves the way it moves, though, how the folds catch the light, how its sheer mass makes her look anchored, regal, unyielding. He insists it's worth it. She tries to run for a scene, but the dress catches on itself, and she freezes mid-stride. The camera crew keeps rolling because you never know when an accident will turn into magic. That take doesn't make it into the final cut, but the laughter that follows, the chorus of crew members rushing in to lift the hem like loyal courtiers, becomes one of those moments people remember years later. On another day, far to the north, Vincent Cassel stands at the edge of a cliff in Calabria, wind whipping his coat into a kind of living sculpture. He's meant to gaze out at the horizon, the embodiment of a king restless for new pleasures. The trouble is, the wind is not cooperating. It's not just blowing, it's howling, tearing at hair, clothes, even the script pages Garrone is holding. Vincent shouts over the gale, "If I get blown into the sea, at least it'll be dramatic." They shoot the scene in short bursts between gusts, the crew crouching like conspirators to hold equipment steady. By the end, everyone's cheeks are pink with cold, but the footage has that wild, untamed quality Garrone wanted all along. One of the strangest behind-the-scenes tales belongs to the flea. Yes, the flea. In the story, the king raises a flea until it's the size of a calf, a bizarre symbol of his own misplaced devotion. The creature was no digital phantom. It was built, painstakingly, by the special effects team. Layers of rubbery skin, tiny mechanical joints to twitch its limbs, a surface painted so meticulously you could see the sheen of its blood beneath. When they wheeled it out for the first time, half the crew recoiled instinctively. It was grotesque, alien, yet oddly pitiful. Toby Jones, who plays the flea-loving king, treated the prop like a co-star. He'd stroke its head between takes, murmuring nonsense to it as though reassuring a skittish animal. One afternoon, while they were adjusting the lighting, the flea's mechanical leg twitched unexpectedly. A sound engineer yelped and dropped his boom mic, convinced the thing had come to life. Garrone loved that. Proof, he said, that the uncanny had been achieved. Food on set was another quiet saga. Shooting in remote Italian locations meant catering had to be inventive. Some days, meals were feasts. Long tables of pasta, fresh bread, cheeses that smelled like the hills themselves. Other days, especially in cramped castle interiors where kitchens were centuries old and mostly decorative, lunch was cold sandwiches eaten on marble staircases. There's a photo somewhere of John C. Reilly, in full regal costume, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a paper plate balanced on his knee, grinning like a schoolboy. The sea monster scene, one of the film's most haunting, was a technical nightmare. The creature's design involved both a partial physical build, sections of its body and head that could be filmed in close-up, and digital augmentation. But filming in the Alcantara Gorge meant dealing with freezing water and slippery rocks. Divers in wetsuits worked just out of frame, ready to steady Salma as she waded into the current. At one point, the current caught part of the prop, sending it spinning toward a cluster of expensive lights. A quick-thinking grip leapt into the water, wrestling the foam and metal beast like some medieval fishermen. Garrone insisted they keep shooting. The chaos is part of it, he said. And in a way, he was right. The scene pulses with that same unpredictable energy. The cast bonded in ways only people working in strange, intense conditions can. Between takes, they'd huddle together for warmth in drafty corridors, swapping stories about previous shoots, bad costumes, and the quirks of working with animals. Shirley Henderson, tiny, fierce, and endlessly funny, often broke tension with impersonations, slipping into the voice of her character even while ordering coffee. B.B. Cave, new to such an elaborate production, described the whole experience as being in a dream where everyone speaks a different language, but somehow you understand. Garrone's directing style fascinated the cast. He was exacting in some ways, obsessed with how a shaft of light might fall across a character's cheek, but utterly loose in others, often throwing away the script for a moment to follow an actor's instinct. You're not just acting, he'd tell them, you're living inside the painting. Sometimes he'd walk away from the monitor mid-take, drifting into the scene itself, adjusting a curtain or moving a candle, then returning without a word. It could be unnerving, but it kept everyone alert, alive to the possibility that anything could change. Challenges were constant. Moving equipment through centuries-old stone passageways without damaging the walls required precision and patience. Rainstorms appeared without warning, turning outdoor sets into mud pits. One night, filming in a remote forest, the generators failed, plunging the entire crew into darkness. For a few minutes, the only light came from the candles the actors still carried, flickering against the trees. Garrone stood in the shadows, smiling. "It's perfect," he said. And in that moment it was... Then there were the quieter struggles, fatigue, the repetition of long days, the mental wear of inhabiting such intense, sometimes grotesque stories. But the crew carried each other through it. Someone always had chocolate in their pocket. Someone always had a bad joke ready. Someone always knew the nearest cafe that would still be open after midnight. By the end, what they'd built together felt like more than a film. It was a traveling family, a kind of shared hallucination. When the final wrap was called, there were hugs, tears, and the strange emptiness of knowing the dream was over. But the castles remained, the forests remained, the flea, mercifully, was packed away, and the memories lingered, stitched into each person's life like a story they could never quite explain to anyone who hadn't been there. There's a kind of truth that only comes dressed in strange clothes. Some films shout their ideas at you, all neon and obvious, but this one wears a mask. It speaks in riddles, in whispered parables, in images that feel like they've been carried out of some ancient wood by a wind that hasn't changed in centuries. You don't just watch it. You sort of breathe it in, and before you know it, you're tangled up in its roots. At first, the stories seem unrelated. A queen desperate for a child, a king infatuated with a voice he's never seen, a father whose affections twist into obsession over something bizarre and the film didn't just adapt fairy tales. It lived one, in all its mess, beauty, and impossible wonder. It begins at dawn. I am standing barefoot on the cold stone surface of Castel del Monte in Puglia. The air here feels heavier, like history has pressed its weight into every block of marble. The castle's perfect octagonal symmetry rises against the pale sky, and even in the stillness there's something almost unnatural about it. I imagine Garrone standing here for the first time, sensing that this was not just a location, but a character, one that would speak in silence, in shadows, in geometry. It would become the castle of the king of high hills, a place where loneliness sits on the throne as much as any monarch. In its emptiness, it holds both majesty and melancholy. Southward, across Italy, the hunt for places that live somewhere between reality and dream continued. The labyrinthine gardens of Donna Fugita Castle in Sicily were one such discovery, a perfect maze of hedges that seemed designed to trap not just bodies but hearts. I picture the scene of a desperate mother chasing her son, the green corridors turning again and again until she can't tell where she began. The setting does not merely host the story, it amplifies it, echoing the confusion, the relentless circling of her mind. Then there are the gorges of Alcantara, carved from black lava near Taormina. Sharp and narrow, with water running cold and fast beneath, they feel ancient and dangerous, as though the earth split itself apart just to hide a secret. Here, the sea monster's lair comes to life. The rock walls glisten, the light fractures across the water's surface, and every ripple carries a sense of foreboding. Garrone doesn't treat it as a scenic backdrop. He films it like a living entity, something you could offend if you look too long. In the forest of Cecedo, near Viterbo, nature feels bewitched. The moss climbs over stones in soft, green blankets, and the twisted branches overhead seem to lean in as though eavesdropping. This is where Garrone placed the two elderly sisters, their home tucked among the gnarled trees. It's not hard to believe that the forest has been watching them for years, silently measuring their ambitions and their fates. What fascinates me is how these locations are not simply chosen for their beauty. They are chosen for their strangeness, for that uncanny quality where reality feels like a set built for a dream. Garrone once spoke of artificial truth, a paradox where something real looks staged, where nature feels more theatrical than a constructed set. That paradox pulses through the film. The influence of Garrone's painters' eye is everywhere. Before filmmaking, he was an artist who studied Caravaggio's deep shadows and Goya's unsettling imagery. It's in the way light falls across a marble floor, not in broad washes but in narrow, diagonal beams, catching dust in the air and making it golden. It's in the half-darkness of a castle corridor, where only a few candles reveal the faces moving through it. The cinematography, led by Peter Suschitzky, embraces that painterly vision. Scenes glow like Baroque paintings, warm candlelight against cool stone, or sunlight refracted through narrow windows into sharp, deliberate shapes. The light isn't just illumination, it's part of the narrative. You can feel the chill of a shadowed hallway, the damp heaviness of an underground cavern, the sudden relief of stepping into a sunlit courtyard. Color, too, is used with precision. Each story has its own palette. The Queen's world is steeped in dark, regal tones, deep blacks, and muted golds. The tale of raw desire is painted in reds, earthy and dangerous. The king's strange obsession with the flea lives in a realm of greens and blues, evoking something wild and secluded. These colors are not confined to costumes. They seep into the walls, the tapestries, the very air of each place. Some interiors are so striking they feel almost impossible. Samazzano Castle in Tuscany, with its Moorish arches and kaleidoscopic walls, becomes a chamber of beauty and suffocation at once. The patterns are hypnotic, perfect for a queen whose desires are equally captivating and destructive. The walls themselves seem to whisper secrets if you linger long enough to listen. The interplay of setting and mood is so deep that each location becomes a psychological portrait of the characters who inhabit it. The queen moves like a restless ghost through her own palace, its vastness mirroring her inner emptiness. The king with the flea lives in a keep so isolated that it feels removed from time. The princess, lost in rocky caves and wild terrain, inhabits spaces that mirror her peril, places that threaten to swallow her completely. Critics often remarked that the film's world feels both timeless and specific, a dream Italy layered over the real one. The castles and forests are authentic, yet in Garrone's hands they are slightly estranged, made strange again. It's the kind of estrangement that makes you notice details you'd overlook in real life. The way a shadow stretches across a staircase, the way fog moves through a courtyard. For the audience, the effect is subtle but lasting. You don't just remember what happened in the story, you remember where it happened. The queen's sorrow in a marble hall, the silence in the flea's fortress before it's broken, the sister's moss-covered home just before betrayal blooms inside it. These places linger in the mind, holding onto the emotions they once staged. In the end, the film's settings do more than provide a stage. They breathe with the story. They carry the weight of myth without erasing the grit of reality. They are both familiar and foreign, both comforting and menacing. And perhaps that's why they work so well. They remind us that every fairy tale, no matter how fantastical, needs a place we can stand in, even if that place feels like it's standing in a dream. It's morning in Sicily, the kind of morning where the air tastes faintly of the sea, even though you're miles inland. The crew is already buzzing in the courtyard of Donna Fugita Castle, cables snaking across cobblestones, wardrobe racks huddled in the shade like strange metallic trees. Somewhere inside, Salma Hayek is fighting with a dress that seems to have declared war on her. It's beautiful, velvet the color of midnight, stitched with threads that glint under the sun, but it weighs nearly as much as a person. And then there were the audience reactions, the strange, beautiful spectrum of them. At early screenings in Italy, you could hear audible gasps in certain moments, laughter in others. Some people leaned forward in their seats, hungry for the next turn. Others sat back, perhaps slightly bewildered by the pacing. One woman I overheard outside a theater in Florence called it a fairy tale for adults who still dream, but have learned to be afraid of their dreams. Another man muttered that it was too slow, but then admitted, after a pause, that some of the images wouldn't leave his head. In the United States, reactions were even more polarized. Some critics called it lush, sensual, and intoxicating. Others dismissed it as indulgent, meandering. But even the harsher reviews often betrayed a grudging respect for its ambition, like they couldn't quite dismiss it entirely. It's hard to walk away from a film that unapologetically strange without at least remembering it. The most touching responses came from viewers who saw themselves in the characters' desires, flaws, or fears. I read accounts from parents who admitted they understood the Queen's desperation in ways that made them uncomfortable. Others saw in the flea-obsessed king a metaphor for their own strange fixations, the things they nurture in secret. There were those who adored the lush visuals but found the stories unsettling, and those who loved that very unease. Some actors, reflecting on these mixed responses, said they were glad the film divided people. In one interview, Toby Jones put it perfectly, "If everyone walks out smiling the same smile, you've probably made something safe." This wasn't safe. Backstage during festival runs, there were little moments between the cast that never made it into official accounts. Salma Hayek hugging BB caved tightly after a tough, emotional scene. Cassel sneaking pastries on his set for the crew during long shooting days. Toby Jones sketching between takes, using a small notebook he always kept in his jacket pocket. These are the details that make a cast feel like more than professionals doing a job. They become a family, even if just for a season. And maybe that's why, when the film finally left theaters and slipped into the quiet life of streaming services and DVD shelves, it didn't vanish entirely. Those who loved it kept talking about it. They passed it on like a book you lend to someone you trust, knowing they'll either treasure it or hand it back confused. That's the risk with films like this. They're not made to please everyone. They're made to find the few who will carry them in their hearts. By the time the press tours were over, the actors had given dozens of interviews, but if you listen closely, there's a common thread, a sense that this was not just another job. It was an immersion, a rare chance to be part of something that might not have been universally adored, but was undeniably unique.